At the moment, what we're seeing is 60% of farms at 600 cover, they have to mine farm cover. Take that down too low. It's going to be a costly exercise to get back out of that. Nitrogen has to be applied now. Nitrogen has to be up to date in all farms. We're talking about 75 kilos of nitrogen, organic and chemical, up to date on farms, and have that in place get the farm to grow.
I'm joined this week by Michael O'Donovan, head of the Grassland Science Department in Teagasc Moorepark. Michael joins us to discuss the grassland performance on dairy farms over the last number of years, how farmers can increase the amount of pasture grown on farm, and outlines some key decisions that need to be made over the coming weeks to ensure high levels of animal performance over the next number of months. I started by asking Michael to outline the grass growth trends over the last number of years.
So the trends have been, I suppose, a bit inconsistent. When you look at the drought periods of 18, and then we have a couple of droughts, kind of shorter term droughts, in 2023, 2022. So when I look at the pasture-based figures overall in the last 10 years, the average dry matter production for the longer term, let's say pasture-based farmers, is about 13.2 tonne. And the variation then is from 11 tonne up to about 14.2 tonne. So there's about a 3.5 tonne difference there in a year in annual production. And that's been driven by probably weather conditions. Obviously, droughts and periods of high rainfall have kind of major effects on grass production. And then in the last couple of years, the trend has been downward in dry matter production. Some of that has been driven by, very poor spring conditions. In the last March 2024 was a really tough spring regarding grazing. Both grazing was interrupted and both nitrogen and slurry applications were interrupted. And that did cost a ton of dry matter, approximately. So you could say, in the last, say, 5 years, it's been a bit inconsistent. But, notwithstanding, there's a bit of a policy change as well with nitrogen regulation. However, there was good news this week, actually, when you look at the nitrogen concentration report from the EPA, where, the trend has been downward in 2024 for nitrogen concentration. So, we have to probably acknowledge that a lot of the work that has been done now at farm level is coming through, and the consistent indications are now that water quality is improving at in the river level. So we must acknowledge that, but notwithstanding, we do need to address some of the grass growth trends which are downward as well.
You mentioned the weather, and that's obviously that variation. It's becoming more prominent, I suppose, year in, year out. That's something that we kind of have to build into our systems. And how are we doing that? How much of those reductions, I suppose, is down to those weather events versus maybe people would say, obviously, a reduction in nitrogen usage on farms is having an impact as well?
Well, they're definitely related because when you look at where nitrogen, when you can't apply nitrogen, let's say last February, March, because there was probably over 270 mils of rain between the 2 months. So that completely interrupted, let's say, nitrogen application. It completely interrupted slurry applications. So when those two, let's say, inputs into grass are delayed, and then you have the kind of conditions of, let's say, you have low soil temperatures, waterlogged soils, that does restrict the onset of grass growth and restricts spring grass growth. And we need to be clear here. We're dealing with a seasonal grass growth curve. And pasture and grass, let's say, does need to be fed with an input to kick itself off. And you could say in the years of, let's say, very high nitrogen prices, nitrogen got very, very delayed with its application, too delayed in some cases. And, then I suppose some farmers got afraid of allowances of nitrogen, and that probably got a bit confused as well. But coming back to the first point, whether using nitrogen, all it has got a bit more precise in the last couple of years. And, there are impacts. We know that, we're getting 7% wetter, 7% more rainfall in the last 20 years. And so, temperature has increased by 0.07 degrees, I think, in the last 30 years as well. So we know the trend is changing. But the grass growth long-term predictions that we have are showing that, okay, um, it mightn't grow at one time of the year, but it'll be growing at the other time of the year. For instance, we might get a lot more winter growth. And we probably saw decent winter growth up until we got to snow this year. So there's opportunities here. I don't think it's not. It's a bit of it's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge now ahead as regards precision nitrogen management when that goes out and the timing of that and making sure it goes out at the right time. That's definitely something that has improved in the last two. Like we have the grass growth model since the drought of 18, when it necessitated we need to get more precise with prediction of grass growth. But definitely nitrogen application, getting better with that has been something that's been improving. And you can all say that we have, limits of 300,000 tons, in the climate action plan, but that can be just used better. I think that can be just used better at farm level, and I think we're going to get better at that anyway.
And you mentioned it there, both go hand in hand, but we'll say usage of nitrogen in the right conditions. There's farms this spring, Mick, that held off on that February nitrogen application, maybe fearful of allowances. Would it be better used at other periods of the year? Where's your
Yeah,
messaging around that, and what's the advice on that?
yeah. Well, like I suppose nitrogen is a multiplier input, and that's how we have to look at nitrogen. It's you put on a kilo of nitrogen and you get a direct response at the right time. From in spring we would say the response at the right conditions with a perennial ryegrass swards can be up beyond 15 kilos of dry matter per kilo of nitrogen applied. And the one thing we do know, and we have plenty of data on it, is and there's a bit of a confused message going out there, not from I suppose not from ourselves, but out there in the wider scheme that oh, you delay nitrogen. But the one thing we know, you delay nitrogen, you're delaying the onset of grass growth by upwards of a month. So you want to delay nitrogen too late, you're going to be finding some other input to feed your herd, which unfortunately is a much dearer input than grazed pasture. And like we know that, and that message is clear. But coming back to the point of applying nitrogen, we need to be careful when we apply it. It has to go out. That's when there's good grass growing conditions, when soils can take it, when they can respond, and all that criteria is there. And then the one thing I think is probably, and I was looking at pasture based data. And we changed one of our strategies for nitrogen to having those targets applied by the middle of the month. Because you apply nitrogen today, the response that you're getting is over the next 3 weeks. So delaying it too late means your response is delayed. And we do know, the application is, for 75 kilos, both organic and chemical, by the middle of April. And that's really to make sure that there's nitrogen in the ground to activate the plant for a response for grass growth to be high in April going into May. And then you have to supplement that then with more nitrogen in the following rotations. And like if you look at the grass growth curve and the peak grass growth curve, previously we were peaking at 100, now that's come back down to 80. That's because in a way some of that nitrogen has been delayed and it's been delayed too much. Now, and most farms do have a demand of beyond 3.5 cows per hectare in the middle of the year. So there's a demand for 70, 80 kilos of grass, and that's not going to come on its own. And delaying it too much into the latter half of the year, is probably a self-defeating purpose. We need, in any growth curve in any year, 65-70% of the grass is grown by the middle of July. And we know the leaching that takes place in the latter half of the year, not so much in spring.
So we shouldn't actually be thinking about that. Maybe that nitrogen application in that early May period that's doing all the heavy lifting. It's that nitrogen applied prior to that as well. That's going to really drive that mid-season growth that you mentioned.
You can look at growth curves and you can look at where nitrogen has been delayed in that April period, and that has a significant effect of reducing the grass growth in that May period. And all this is, you can have dry Mays too. We had a period of dryness here in last May, and like obviously then when you have very dry periods, you have to be careful with your nitrogen application, and you can come in with let's say soil water or watery slurry or something like that. But notwithstanding that, the nitrogen that you have, let's say in that March, April period, is crucial to getting substantial growth in that, in that peak period. Because you have to have in May, June, they are the months that you have to have growth. And they're the months that, let's say, dilute, they're the big months. So you call it the heavy lifting months. They're the heavy lifting months for having a decent production on farm.
We've got to that kind of early May period. What does the nitrogen applications then look like over that
Like
mid-summer period?
I think I mean, you're touching it. Like it kind of depends here, and there's been a fair bit of movement forward on clover, but like on farm, and we're seeing it. It's been a slow mover. Clover is not the easiest plant to manage. It's a bit more slower to take off in spring, and there's fixation going on in the middle of the year. And really, with clover, the nitrogen saving ability of clover, it comes in the middle of the year when clover is active. When the soil temperature is moving and when there's fixation taking place. Very, very little fixation takes place in the spring with clover. And, that's when chemical nitrogen plays a role as an input in those clover sports. And, we've seen that last year. And some people are saying that clover, it doesn't work. Clover needs it's very much based on the climate. It needs soil temperature, it needs dry conditions. But coming back to the point, we're looking at in the middle of the season, and we've amended, let's say, that clover nitrogen strategy to where there's less clover on paddocks, that you're putting in slightly more nitrogen. Up to maybe 230 kilos of nitrogen on some of those, let's say, zero clover paddocks, high perennial ryegrass paddocks, and then you're taking down the nitrogen off of let's say the high clover paddocks in the middle of the year. And so that's putting up, let's say, 35 kilos of nitrogen in that May period on those paddocks, making sure that those grass only paddocks are growing. And then you can, let's say, drop off the nitrogen somewhat in the middle of the year on the clover paddocks. So there's a kind of a transfer. Once you're at the same allowance, you're just basically I suppose we talked about precision nitrogen slightly. The precision nitrogen I'm talking about is on nearly a paddock to paddock basis. You're dropping out nitrogen, or you're dropping down nitrogen on the high clover paddocks, and you're replacing that nitrogen on the grass only paddocks. Because you have to be clear, and we all know this, that clover can vary from paddock to paddock between different years. And, it's the April clover content, May clover content that does really dictate, what you do as regards nitrogen allowances on those paddocks.
Farmers would say maybe clover disappointed in 2024. Why is that, or what's happening on farms with regards to clover?
I suppose clover, and where we are with clover now, and we've had a clover review of all the research that has gone on here the last couple of years, and we work very closely with a group of farmers in the Clover 150 group, myself, Michael Egan, and the Grassland team. But like, clover is one of these, let's say, plants that it's very climate dependent, very weather dependent. It has a higher threshold of temperature for grass growth. And over the winter period, clover content reduces in the sward, and you have a lot of stolen. Let's say the stolons become more apparent in the overwinter period than actually the actual clover content. So, like, when you go onto farms now today, there's probably little enough clover in the overall sward horizon. That's very much driven by what has happened over the winter, and some stolen regression. And that's going to accumulate now as you go into the year, and we see more clover contents and paddocks as the year comes on. And like, clover content is really only apparent from, let's say, April through to, let's say, October, November. And, that's when you see clover, really working in that mid-season period. So for me, and looking at clover, and we're trying to get clover onto farms because we see it as a strategy of improving animal performance, in reducing the surplus, and, yes, we're doing some leaching work now, and the leaching work, when we get more leaching work in, I think it'll show that clover, is probably similar enough to perennial ryegrass swards as regards its overall leaching. But what we are seeing is that there's very good fixation taking place with clover when you have decent clover content on paddocks. And
when you talk about that, what's decent clover content?
But like, we're not talking about a full 100% clover content. And like, that's not what you want here. What we're talking about is, between 10 to 20% of clover content on a farm over the year. And, we're not pushing for anything higher than that. You don't need anything higher than that. And if you have something like that, and the example I would give of, let's say, the better, let's say, the better performance in the Clover 150 group, they're producing, 14 and a half ton of grass with about 180 kilos of chemical nitrogen, about 25 kilos of organic nitrogen. And there's, let's say, a fixation of probably 60 to 80 kilos of nitrogen coming from 15 to 20% clover in the sward. And, that to me is very good performance. It's coming on the back of having very good soil fertility, good grazing management, and the precision nitrogen that we talked about earlier. So, we don't need to have full clover swards. That's not what we're after here. We want, let's say, clover mixed through the sward in a perennial ryegrass sward, where the animal is grazing it consistently in the grazing period, and then that we have, let's say, a contribution of the clover, the nitrogen, which is helping the grass growth of the farm. And in a way, grass and clover have to work together. One synergizes the other. So fixation is driving the grass growth of the sward. And if you obviously, if you don't have enough clover, if you don't have clover fixing nitrogen, then chemical nitrogen comes into play to offset that deficit. So, but like, when we look at the clover contents on the Clover 150 group, paddocks are varying in their clover content across years. So you can have high clover paddock that'll drop down across years, and some of that is coming probably, it might overproduce in a year. It might get an overproduction of clover growth in a year, and then it comes back and regresses back. And then over a couple of years, the one thing about clover is it's not steady state. If you want to have clover on the farm, you have to be reseeding in and you have to be oversown. One of them will not work on its own, and that's really clear. And that's, that has been the successful, let's say, incorporation of clover on the 150 farms. Dual approach, and clover oversowing is very simple. You oversow, you go in fast, like on-off grazing, you graze off those paddocks quite fast to get it established over 2 or 3 rounds. You use soil water, less nitrogen, and you get it in. And it's done early in the year. If it's done too late, you don't get it done. So, like, that has worked. And to be honest with you, James, we don't have all the answers here. But what we do say is, when we look at the dairy, beef, and sheep performances with clover in the sward, there's an 8% increase in annual performance. There's a reduction in surplus. So it's adding something to the system. But like, the clover journey for Irish dairying, across, let's say, 16,000 farmers is going to take some time. Clover won't persist with low soil fertility. And one thing I would say is, for a farmer, is if you don't have good soil fertility, going after clover is a waste of your time. You have to correct pH. And one of the realizations that I had a couple of years ago is, on one of the farm walks, really successful oversowing and reseeding regime, but the soil fertility was fantastic. And like, that's, go to a farm walk with the 150 groups. If you don't have good soil fertility, clover needs high pH. And like, it's a reasonably decent milk price year. One of the key things I'd be saying to farmers is go and start soil fertility, go and start soil pH this year.
I'm coming back to the trends. The trends are downward. Annual grass growth obviously has an impact on optimum stocking rates for farms. For our farmer listeners, how are they going to grow more grass? Individual farms sitting at 12 ton is probably where the average is over the last few years. Is that fair to say? Making PPI farms. As a farmer, how am I going to grow more grass?
So, the one thing I suppose we would have to say is that there's been huge, let's say, technology upgrading on farms in the last number of years since quotas have been abolished. There's a lot more things going on farms. There's more calvings, there's more cows, and I suppose the one thing we would see is we're really good in Ireland on grassland, and What we have seen in the last couple of years is a trend downward, and that's coupled with some weather conditions and some less nitrogen. So there's a couple of things we would say, right? Are your swards productive? Is your soil fertility where it should be? And we got soil fertility back, let's say, a couple of weeks ago in Moorepark, and I was looking at the pHs, and we have about the pHs at a place where we want, all at optimum soil pHs. And that has taken some time, and we're correcting that every year. So lime has to go out on a farm every year. It's an input the same as chemical nitrogen. You have to put lime out every year because there's paddocks dropping down in pH and there's paddocks coming up in pH, and straight away then that has an availability of soil nitrogen to your plants, which is free nitrogen that's being, let's say, optimally mineralized. So there's two things, productive pastures, good soil pH. The next thing then is, have your stocking rate on the farm capable for the growth capacity of your farm? And that's a question that some people will have to line up and critically analyze for over, let's say, a 5-year period. Is your stocking rate aligned to your grass growth potential? And in some farms, you have to be realistic and say it's not. They're overstocked. And then you have to say to them, those farmers have to ask themselves, is there capacity here to grow grass? Am I, let's say, applying nitrogen at the right time for those paddocks to improve their performance? And if you look at it realistically, there's probably every farmer in the country can probably grow, 2 ton more grass. And it probably wouldn't come with a huge level of change. Collect soil fertility, bit more precision, bit more preciseness with nitrogen. And with nitrogen, I'm talking about application of nitrogen and the timing of nitrogen. This monthly spreading of nitrogen. Again, whole farm growing at the same level at one time, very, very difficult to manage that. All we're talking about here is nitrogen needed at the right time and the right responses, and getting it on early enough in the season that you're getting this April, May, June growth rate capitalized on. And that thing, 65% produced by the middle of July. That's an important, let's say, benchmark for any farmer. And the final thing I'd say then is we have pasture base, and we're improving pasture base all the time. And pasture base there has benchmarks there for different times of the year. We want 2 ton of grass growing by the first week of April. That's a benchmark, 2 ton of grass growing. And I look at and I analyze grass growth production from different farms across the season. All the better farmers will grow more grass in all the different seasons. It's just not one season. It's spring, it's summer, it's autumn. And the other thing I would say is the farm cover targets that we have across the season, I talk about growing 2 ton of grass. Some farms are just getting grazed too early, too fast in spring. There's not enough grass on them. And you take down the farm cover too low, you take down the growth rate of the farm. So I would say, in all honesty, opening farm covers are too low on a lot of farms. That means then subsequently the farm cover by the 10th of April is too low. You take that down too low, and you're probably bringing down growth rate by about 30% in that April period. So when I say that's too low, some farmers are finishing that first round too early. And then the other 2 farm covers is the autumn, mid-September cover, and the closing cover. And then in the middle of the year, you're using kilos of dry matter per cow aligned with the stocking rate. And but to me, the April farm cover, dropping that too low, that kills growth rate, and that kills growth rate. So fellas will have to be patient. Probably this year, and you saw the Grass 10 newsletter last week, where we have 60% of farmers at a cover of around 600. Those guys have to be very patient this year, and they're going to have to fill that deficit in grass with, let's say, silage and concentrate in order to budge your grass out into that early April period. So that farm cover, those farm cover targets are important, and there has been a move off them the last couple of years.
Is there enough reseeding, and I will move on maybe to the current situation, is there enough reseeding happening on farms? And some of those farms you mentioned that's maybe under pressure for grass growth, chasing their tail a little bit to maybe try and keep grass in front of them. The reseeding's dropping off on those farms, Mick, is it? The capacity isn't there to be taking this land out to reseed. So it's a chicken and egg. We want that 10% reseeded every year. Is it happening on farms?
Um, it's not. It's not, and sometimes like reseeding to me is a simple enough thing to change the parent material, the parent grass material on a farm, and to get clover in, right? And if you, and I don't want to be too critical of the low reseeding levels that came last year, because it came very wet very early, very cold very early, and then we got into a very dry May, and we had reseed here in Moorepark. We didn't get into graze it in the clover trial until early early July. It just got totally stunted in that May June period, and so last year was a tricky enough year. But like, if you reflect back on that, um, reseeding has to go early in spring. If the fella is, or the person is thinking of reseeding, they got to pick their paddock and they got to have a plan of what's going on, and it kind of has to happen a bit like clockwork, because if it goes, like we talk about, a 60-day turnaround, if it goes to 80 or 90 days, you're really hitting the growth curve in the farm. And from for the perspective of reseeding, is reseeding done right gives you a huge response. It's expensive now. It's €1,000 per hectare all costs. But for what it can grow, it can give you a return back in definitely 2 years. So from my perspective of reseeding, and we know now there's better clover varieties out there, there's better grass varieties out there. All that's coming through, let's say, and in the PPI, and we'll have a clover profit index in time. But we know now that, and like you're talking about why aren't farms going well. There's a ton and a half of difference between the top PPI variety and the bottom PPI variety, and there's probably another ton difference between the top clover variety and the bottom clover variety. So there's 2.5 ton of a difference there. And okay, that's instantaneous on a paddock and a reseeded paddock if it's well managed. But to be honest with you, reseeding has to be part of what we do here. And it doesn't have to be plowing. It can be, it can be well reseeded, making sure the soil, the cultivation is good, that it's well rolled, and then you have good post-emergent spray. But like, we're in a grass-based system. We have to rejuvenate swards. Some swards get lose perennial ryegrass content, lose clover content, and they have to be retillered with better quality material. So it's part of what we do. And the best lads, the best guys out there that are growing those tonnages, they're reseeding every year. Doesn't matter what way the year comes.
But maybe as we head into that second round, mid-season, high performance off grass, where do people set demand, grass allowance, grass intake, that whole conversation, I suppose. So to start with that, you mentioned that their average farm cover has to be managed now up until that kind of 10th of April, mid-April period. And that's really that's not dropping below 600, Mick, is that?
Yeah, and like that's a crucial thing now. Like, if farm cover drops too low here, it's going to take a fair bit of management and a fair bit of time for it to come back up. At the moment, what we're seeing is 60% of farms at 600 cover, they have to mind farm cover. Take that down too low, it's going to be it's going to be a costly exercise to get back out of that. So, and that means they have to push out the first round, finish around 10th of April, and farmers will have to decide that themselves and do a fast budget on that. And or get on to your advisor to do that and talk to some of the guys in your group. But that's fairly crucial. Nitrogen has to be applied now. Nitrogen has to be up to date in all farms. And we're talking about, it's the 21st of March. We're talking about 75 kilos of nitrogen, organic and chemical, up to date on the farms, and have that in place to get the farm to grow. And then, as regards feeding the cow, obviously you want to get as much grass into the diet as possible. You're coming into the March period. Intake is going up. Very, very good grazing conditions at the moment. Exceptional grazing conditions. I'm looking at, rainfall of 9 mils so far in March, compared to last year. I think we had 159 mils in March. And very good grass dry matters, very content cows milking very well at the moment. Um, and where you have grass, obviously there's huge gains to be made in optimizing that with cows, getting decent intakes of cows early on now, and getting what I would say in March is where you protect your protein content, for the rest of the year. Don't let it drop too much. So obviously, like what we would like, to see is cows getting as much grass as they can, depending on how much grass is on the farm. And some guys will probably won't be able to put cows by night for maybe another week or two, and that's the situation they're in, and they're going to have to manage through that. But you're managing cow performance, you're managing cow intake, and we know that cow intake, Sarah Walsh's new work has been really insightful for us. They're eating more earlier on, and their intake profile is increasing by about 0.6, 0.7 of a kilo a week. As you go into it, going into a peak of about 18 and a half, 19 kilos, and mature cows are eating more than that, and the younger cows are eating slightly less, but that's the average for the herd.
So you mentioned that there, and that's work that I think farmers are becoming more familiar with, and the 18 and a half herd level intake, we'll say, as we head into that second round and decisions are made in terms of maybe closing up ground for first cut silage, reseeding needs to be added into that as well, making it's often left to one side. We close up for silage and then we decide maybe we want to reseed and we're pushing that stocking rate up further.
Yeah.
Where is that sweet spot? Like, of that 18 and a half kilos of total intake, how much of that do you want to be as grazed grass?
As much as you possibly can. I haven't visited too many farms in the last couple of years where there's low concentrate going in April and May, and I've run plenty of trials with no concentrate going into cows in April and May, and they perform very well, and the point is here, if the grazing platform stocking rate, what can a farm grow? Can it grow 75, 80 kilos in that peak period? Some of the allowances, I would say, in pasture base are too low. We would see allowances going in at 15 kilos. Cows are eating a lot more than that. So that's probably something that farmers probably have to look at in the PBI, that they have to increase their allowances higher than what actually they're probably set at. And then how much concentrate a fella is going to feed in the middle of the year. Some of that is very grass dependent, but also it's dependent on the grazing stocking rate. But so I would say, like, most farms can grow 75, 80 kilos mid-season. They should be able to grow that. And if they can't, the grazing stocking rate has to come back. The platform stocking rate has to come back. And that would set like a demand of let's say 70 kilos. At 3.5 is about 19 kilos of allowance in and around.
And that's probably going to get, what's the difference in allowance and intake?
Like if you're allowing
system.
If you're allowing 20 kilos, you'd expect them to be eating 18.5.
It's about a kilo and a half above.
Yeah. If you're allowing 17,
what intake will be.
If you're allowing 17, they probably intake will be about 15.5. If they were being pushed to, probably 16. So the straight allowance is not, let's say, allowing 17 to eat 17. They don't.
So is it for farmers now to maybe look back at their growth rates in that May-June period, and work back of kind of 19 kilos to get 17.5 kilos of grass, and that's where you should be pitching that kind of stocking rate at that mid-season period?
Well, the stocking rate really has to be pitched like, what's your grazing platform stocking rate? And I was looking at stuff yesterday. One guy was at 3. Obviously he's going to close off silage ground. And one guy was at 3.6. And there wasn't, not much silage ground, and he had a low cover, and there wasn't that much silage ground to close off and that, because you have to build cover on the farm first. But For me, I suppose really you kind of have to say, I want to give grass to the cows. I want to perform in the middle of the year. I want to optimize their protein. That's one of the things that you want to do in the grazing system. You want them to perform. And you don't want to be overfeeding concentrate. There's no need to overfeed concentrate in the middle of the year. That's the time when you should be making decent levels of production from the lowest inputs. And like I see people for 4 kilos. That's excessive the concentrate usage in the middle of the year. And responses are questionable at that time as well. So you come back to your question, you want to get 17.5 kilos of grass, you're probably going to have to allow 19 kilos. And then you're going to have to.
I'm just looking there at some of the Grass Tennessee had a table out there looking at that mid-season growth rates, and it was probably in around that 65.
Yeah.
So for farms, that's probably going to be somewhere around 3.4 of a stocking rate, unless, as you say, that the farmer is capable of growing the 70, 75s, 80 in that period.
Yeah, and like if you want to stock at 4 cows to the hectare for 6 weeks, that's an 80 kilo growth, right? 75 to 80 kilo growth for 6 weeks if you're closing silage round. No.
There's not many farms doing that, Mick, at the minute.
At the minute, no, but if you want to do that, that's what you're setting your farm up to do. So, making that decision, you want to be careful making that decision because, that means something else is going in as well. You're all setting that, let's say, demand with another feed. And that's the other thing I want to say, James, in the last couple of years, and we see it particularly now, is that there's a lot of nitrogen swapping going on around the place. And when I mean nitrogen swapping, there's concentrate coming in. And that's been offset. That's offsetting some of the lower nitrogen usage that you see on some farms. And then there's feed being fed. And obviously some of that feed, the silage being fed, is because it's offsetting the reduced grass growth in the farm in the middle of the year. But, we do need to be careful that, I think I have a figure of 60 kilos of concentrate nitrogen fed last year in one of the project groups. That's too much. It's too much.
So getting that kind of demand right it's crucial from an animal performance point of view, as you say, to get high levels of grazed grass in, but also in terms of an imported feed question as well, which we've probably crept up on, Mick, over the last few years. So I suppose it's important that lads get that decision right in the coming weeks.
We're not anti-concentrate, but we are anti-high concentrate. I would say, concentrate is an input, the same as nitrogen. And it should be used with a bit more precision than it is.
Final question for you. 1,400 covers.
Yeah.
Why are they so important? Sometimes the question crops up, well, sure, what about a 1,600, 1,700? Will I grow more grass if I'm slightly higher stocked? Is that the right thing to do?
1,400 kilos is basically getting the balance between intake and graze out and getting the performance that you're at you're at 3 leaf level. And ultimately, we did a lot of work here in a PhD looking at 1,400s versus thousands, less than that, and then up to 2,3. And, really and truly, the 1,400, and the 1,400 is going to vary. It's going to be 1,300 in some paddocks, and it could be 1,700. But that, let's say, that range of hitting 1,100 kilos, it's in at 10 centimeters and it's out at 4. And that's the optimum really for animal performance. I always say it's in at 10, out at 4. It's not in at 12 and out at 4. Because you go in at 12 centimeters, big canopy, animals going down, eating a lot more, let's say, stemmy material. And in some cases, cows graze with their thumb, they can't go down. There's a physical barrier there, they can't go down. So that 1,400 is really the template of trying to get the optimum between animal performance, utilization, and grass growth.
Very good, Mick. I think we'll leave it at that. Excellent insights there in terms of the bigger picture stuff, but also in terms of the short term and decisions farmers should be making over the coming weeks to optimise animal performance and do a good job with grazing this season. I'm sure the coming weeks, there's a couple of decisions to be made in the coming weeks, especially on farms where there's a bit of a lag in grass production. But ultimately what you want to do is get your nitrogen up to date and get grass into the diet for as long as possible, and watch that first rotation that it doesn't end too early. That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. My thanks to Michael O'Donovan for joining me on this week's show. If you have any questions about this week's episode or have suggested topics you would like discussed, please send them on to the following email address: dairyedge.podcast@teagasc.ie. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm James Dunne, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.